There are more food banks than McDonald's in the UK. And when I heard that, I just thought, I can't continue being part of this system, which is essentially designed to keep concentrating wealth and minimising tax.
All right, Steph Brobbey. I've been trying to get you on the channel for ages. Thanks for coming and agreeing to do the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, as you know, on the channel, we talk a lot about the rich and about tax. And your background is you were a tax advisor for the very wealthy. So I was hoping you could help educate our audience a little bit about what life is like for the very rich and their tax situation. So could you tell us a little bit about your background and what you used to do?
Yeah, so I grew up in West London. My parents are Ghanaian migrants. They came here in the 1980s, and I grew up on a council estate with my 3 siblings and my parents, and lived in a kind of regular working class community in kind of Shepherd's Bush, and then moved to Hammersmith when I was about 12, still in social housing. But then I kind of moved onto a really, really fancy street in Hammersmith, which was kind of my first experience of wealth and privilege. And that's actually how I ended up getting work experience, through meeting people locally.
Okay.
So it really kind of changed the trajectory of my life, just moving off an estate onto a street in Hammersmith.
That's a bit similar to me in a sense, because when I was 10, I passed my 11 plus. I went to grammar school, and I don't think I would have become a trader if it wasn't for the kids that I met there, who they sort of knew in the family, these are the best jobs. That's why I ended up there.
Yeah.
So that is what sort of pushed you to go into the area you went into?
Well, I was always really passionate about justice, and I wanted to become a human rights lawyer. And actually, someone on my street owned a law firm, super casual, and she kind of arranged for me to have work experience. And I went to study law at university, at Cardiff University. And to be honest, when I was studying for my law degree, I wasn't sure I was going to end up qualifying as a solicitor. Thought I might end up as a civil servant or something. But what ended up happening was that I qualified as a solicitor. I went to train in the city as a solicitor, got a training contract, which is like really competitive. Everybody tells you it's so competitive. That was my kind of first experience, kind of lived experience of what it's like to have proximity to wealth and to kind of witness how much wealth people have access to, and not just property and assets, but like social capital and kind of cultural capital.
So we talk on this channel about wealth a lot, and one thing that I think is important for people to realise is, so we were talking about this before, and I speak about it in my video, What is Wealth? When I was a kid, my sort of perception of what a rich person is somebody who earns like 60, 70 grand a year. Like when I was a kid, that was like, if you have that, you're super, super rich. And I want to talk about a little bit about what it means to be rich, and what are the different kinds of rich, and what rich is, because this is a question we get all the time on the channel, right? What is rich? What do you mean by rich? And I talk quite a bit about my sort of personal level of wealth in the media, and so my background come from a similar sort of background to you. I was pretty poor growing up. I got a job in the city. I made quite a lot of money quickly. Now I've quit that and I do this sort of job all the time, and I'm able to live off of that money that I made, but I'm not able to live like a super luxurious life. But I don't really have experience personally of what I would call super rich, which is people who have wealth in the sort of tens of millions, such that even without working, they can make incomes in the sort of hundreds of thousands and live luxurious lives. So were you working with people at sort of that level of wealth?
Yeah, it was actually a real mixture of people. Some were very, very wealthy in the tens of millions and a lot more. And some were, I guess, what we would consider maybe, in London in particular, we don't tend to think of this amount of money as a lot of money, because a lot of people's houses are worth a few million. But I think it's the top 1% richest households in the UK have net wealth of 3.6 million, which doesn't sound like a lot to some of us, but obviously it is a lot of money. So anywhere between that kind of upwards of 3.6 million, you know, people in the 1%.
And I want to talk a little bit about these people because, you know, most people don't have much direct experience with people at that sort of level of wealth. And even me, having worked in finance, you know, I didn't work with many really, really rich people. One thing I always remember when I was quitting the city is the bank really, really didn't want me to quit. And one of the senior managers took me into a room and he sat me down and he said to me, that amount of money you made, you think that's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money. You're going to run out of money, you're going to need more money. And, you know, I'd made millions of pounds, right? And, you know, my dad used to work for about 20 grand a year. And I remember thinking, no, that's a lot of money. But I thought it was an interesting mindset, the way that this guy, who I'm sure was richer than me because he'd been working in the industry for a lot longer than me, he thought it's not a lot of money. And how do you think these people who might have wealth of, say, £5 million, £10 million, how do you think they perceive themselves and their level of wealth and their family's level of wealth?
It's really interesting, actually, because I think there's this whole, you know, people can be objectively very rich, but they feel poor. There's this mindset around, I guess it's scarcity, right? We've been socialised into a culture that says that we should accumulate as much as possible because, you know, resources are scarce. And even very wealthy people will still benchmark themselves against someone like Bill Gates and say, well, I'm not Bill Gates, but they're still, you know, at the end of the day in the UK, if we know that the top 1% richest households in the UK have 3.6 million at the very minimum, you know, we know that people have a lot of money. But yeah, there's this real culture around scarcity and the need to preserve, the need to pass down assets to future generations. And it's interesting to see, that was one of the things that I observed during my time in practice was that people didn't feel wealthy, you know, even if they had tens of millions of pounds.
Yeah.
So it's just quite interesting, I think, the narratives around, well, what is wealth and what does it mean to be rich, you know?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about interaction with these people personally, because the work you're doing now, you do a lot of work talking to very wealthy people about how they feel about their wealth and how they manage their wealth and how they can manage that to help society. And I've done some stuff with the organisation, so I've met some of these people. And I think for me, what was interesting is, you know, often on my channel, I say we need to tax the rich and I say the rich are damaging society. But when you interact with these people, I think it's important. One thing I think it's important for people to understand is these are not like Bond villain type people, you know, they're real people with families and emotions and with fears and, you know, and sometimes they're concerned about the future. So what's your interaction of these people? Because I think people watching who might not have a chance to interact with these people want to know basically what are they like.
Yeah, I mean, they're human beings like you and me, you know, they have a lot, you know, emotions. They have a lot of challenges that they face, particularly people that I'm working with who really care about social justice. They feel a lot of guilt, a lot of anxiety around how much money they have. Lots of them feel like they have too much wealth. They don't know how to redistribute it. They don't know what responsible wealth stewardship looks like. You know, particularly if they want to help tackle things like climate change and inequality, they feel really stuck, you know, and don't really know what to do. And it's also it's quite a burden for a lot of people, even for people that aren't necessarily social justice oriented. I noticed when I was practicing as a lawyer, you know, it was a great source of anxiety, you know, when you've got so much wealth, all the decisions you have to make, all the, you know, all the different things that advisors put in front of you, decisions about tax, decisions about how you protect and preserve and pass down assets. Yeah,
it's a funny sort of conversation to have because I know a lot of people will be watching and they'll be thinking, well, it sounds all right to me. I would like to do. But, you know, for me personally, as somebody who came from a very poor background and made quite a lot of money, although I'm not super rich, it it was actually quite a stressful experience because, you know, no one in my family ever had money. When I made money, I was super young. I was like 24, 25, right? Like, I had nobody to turn to for like, what do I do with this money? Like, and it's weirdly, in a bizarre way, like kind of terrifying. Like, I remember when I got my big bonus. So in 2011, when I was City Stock Trader, I got a big bonus at the end of the year. And my girlfriend at the time, she came round to my house that evening, and I was like sitting in my little office space in the corner of the room, like working out with these spreadsheets, and you know, and she was like, what are you doing? Like, you seem stressed out. And I was like, look, I've got all this money, I need to invest it, it's really important, of course I'm stressed out. And she was like, if I had as much money as you, the last thing I'd be doing is sitting in the corner of my front room stressing about it. Of course she was right, but if you know, for me, it was quite scary, like knowing how do I protect this, you know what I mean? And I think if you're from a wealthy family, you've probably, I guess, been raised with this idea, like, this is important, it's your legacy, you need to protect it, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, the different narratives that we have when we come from poorer backgrounds. We're afraid of losing the money a lot of the time. And then, you know, people from wealthier backgrounds will see the opportunities that come with wealth, right? And so thinking about different investments, like I was always really fascinated by, you know, when I started working and I realised that people bought, you know, there were cash buyers that existed, and I just never ever thought that anyone would have a few £1 million spare to invest in property and buying cash. But then another thing that I found really interesting is that, you know, lots of people chose to, even though they had the cash, they would get finance, they would raise debt, and
you raised that idea like you should avoid debt, and I think a lot of people are raised with this idea you should avoid debt as much as you can.
Totally. And that was always my, you know, I'm to this day I'm still very risk averse when it comes to debt, but I think if you've been raised to see that actually debt, you know, finance, you know, is a tool
you can use it as
that you can leverage to create more wealth, it's a completely different mindset.
So what was it like for you personally going into that space, you know, not realizing beforehand that people, you know, that people had this kind of money? How did you, as a person, how did you experience that?
Yeah, it was quite daunting. I was quite aware of, you know, very aware of, I don't know what your experience was like, but I was very aware of where I was coming from in society and entering, you know, even the city, being in a big office, it's quite an intimidating space. If you're not used to, I don't know, going to see your dad after work in the city, or, you know, whatever, like I'd never really been in those kinds of environments. So yeah, it was very daunting. I was very aware of my position. The law is, you know, quite hierarchical.
Yeah. For me, I was never intimidated in the space, but I had no idea how much money those people were making.
Yeah.
Seriously, like I thought like these guys were making like 150 grand a year, like, which to me was like, that's crazy money. Like I was getting paid 40 grand a year, and I was like, this is like, I thought I was like a baller at 40 grand a year. And I was thinking these guys, and then when I realized that these guys are making like millions of pounds a year, it was, on the part of me is thinking, wow, this is an opportunity. And part of me was just thinking like, this is crazy. Part of me was actually shocked and upset, I think. Yeah. Because it made me think of my dad and my mum and my friends' parents and how hard they used to work for, like, you know, literally something like 2% of what these guys are making. Yeah. For me, it was just, I think, confusing.
Yeah, it is confusing because what's effectively happening is you're entering a new world, which has completely different culture and kind of social order. I mean, one of the things that I remember quite early on in my career, I don't know if I was a trainee or whether I was just quite early on post-qualification, was when you work in a law firm, you tend to have like these client codes, and then you have like matter numbers. Yeah. And I noticed that there were some clients that just had so many different matter numbers, which kind of cross-reference to various property purchases. And I had this realisation that, gosh, it's the same people or the same types of people that own so much property all over the country and all over London. whether it's residential property or commercial property. And that's when, I think that was when the seed was planted around becoming a bit more politicised around, well, what implications does this have for my city? You know, I really rep hard for London because I'm, I grew up here. I'm really proud to be a Londoner. And I started to think, well, what is this doing? Is this preventing people like me getting on the property ladder?
I think that's a really good point and important for people to realise.
Yeah.
And it's a point I make in my What is Wealth video, which is look at all this wealth around you. You know, not just all the properties, but all the commercial wealth as well. It's all owned. It's all owned. And if you come from an ordinary background, like we do, you don't know people who own a shopping centre. You don't know people who own 10 properties outright, no mortgage. You just don't think that kind of thing is possible. But there are people who own way more than that. There are people who own hundreds of properties. You know what I mean? And think about the income they make from that.
Yeah.
You know, think about, like you say, what does that mean for the rest of us? You know, if they own 100 properties and they're making £20 million a year, you know, and your kids are competing with their kids, you know.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a bit about the financial situation of these kinds of very wealthy people. Yeah. So my understanding is a lot of these very wealthy people essentially don't need to work regular jobs because they can make a lot of income from the wealth that they have. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, so there are, I suppose, people that make money through rent, like through, you know, either commercial or residential property. There are people that, you know, will take a huge dividend, every year, and so they're not deriving they're not living off income that they're working for. It's maybe investment income either from an investment portfolio, or property or kind of business income, essentially.
One point I always like to make on this is, like, if there's somebody who's making income and they're not working for it, somebody else is working for it. As in that money, it doesn't just spring out of the ground, you know what I mean? That comes from when you pay a rent, when you pay a mortgage, or when you have commercial transactions, a chunk of that goes to the owners of the businesses, the owners of the assets.
Yeah.
So I'm always trying to get people to realise there is this cash flow which is constantly going from ordinary people to the owners of assets. And, you know, I'm not super rich, but I'm a relatively wealthy person as well. So that includes me, you know. People who don't own assets are continually giving money to people who do own assets.
Yeah, and I guess you've got to think about the broader implications of that in society. So someone who makes a living from developing properties, you know, doing them up and then selling them at a profit, what is that doing to the market? What's that doing? How's that affecting ordinary people and their ability to buy homes?
Yeah, that's a point I'm always I think I'm always trying to make that connection basically between, and I think what's happening now is really highlighting that. Like, if the rich get richer, does that affect you? Because in COVID, we saw this massive increase of the wealth from the rich. And it was easy to, number one, it's easy to not notice that. Like, if the rich make a ton of money, you know, you don't see that. That happens to them. But does it affect you? Well, if they have a load of money, well, they're going to push up house prices. They're going to buy assets. They're going to buy commodities. You know, it's going to make your life more expensive. So I'm always trying to make that connection because for me, what I do, you know, we spoke about these guys they're not Bond villains. They're ordinary people. I've got no hatred for the rich. I myself am a rich person, but what I am is an economist, you know. And I think if these guys are generating huge amounts of income and buying more and more of the assets and taking more and more of the share of the wealth, then it's going to make ordinary people poorer.
Yeah, I mean, I think a point I always like to make is that wealth is not created in a vacuum. And this is, you know, it's not about demonising wealthy people. I actually had really good relationships with a lot of my clients back, you know, when I was a solicitor. And they were really nice people. But wealth is not created in a vacuum. There's a whole, you know, it's in the context of a broader economic system. There are political choices that are made in order to enable, you know, and facilitate certain people, certain groups of people, certain demographics to benefit and to grow their wealth or to create wealth.
Yeah, this is the point I'm always trying to make is, look, I've got nothing against rich people, but what I don't like is ordinary families being driven into poverty, and these things are, in my opinion, connected. Okay, but what I want to talk about now is tax.
Yeah.
So we all hear it in the press that very rich people don't pay much taxes. You are probably the expert to talk about that. Is that true?
Well, I think what I realised, I mean, one of the things, just by way of background, I was on an amazing career trajectory. I loved my job. I used to skip into work. I thought it was brilliant. I was, you know, I had the intellectual and academic stimulation. I had great relationships with my clients. My team were absolutely amazing. And I loved it. But it was over a number of years that I started becoming quite politicized around wealth, and typically around a budget or an autumn statement, or, you know, when you would hear about the threat of a Labour government, I started to think, well, what, you know, surely if you're forced to pay more tax, you're generally on the winning side of life. So why are there all these really negative narratives around tax that are kind of coming out of the industry that I'm working in? So, you know, a lot of my, essentially the catalyst for leaving my job was realising that my work was being really skilled and doing well at my work was having an impact, a detrimental impact on our economy, and specifically depriving our government and probably some governments around the world, you know, when dealing with international clients, depriving those governments of their ability to raise taxes, the correct amount of revenue to invest in public services. And this all came to a head when a friend of mine told me on New Year's Eve in 2019 that there are more food banks than McDonald's in the UK. And when I heard that, I just thought, I can't continue being part of this system, which is essentially designed to keep concentrating wealth and minimising tax. So a lot of my job was to, you know, I did a lot of succession planning and advising on kind of asset protection and asset preservation, helping people to pass down assets, that, you know, their wealth to their families, to their children, grandchildren. And that would invariably involve a level of tax advice, normally around what we call capital taxes, so inheritance tax, capital gains tax, on sort of gifts and inheritance and that kind of thing. And, you know, I realised that by giving this advice, I was directly contributing to this problem that we have now, where the government doesn't have enough revenue to invest in public services.
I think it's super relevant to what's happening now, and this is something which I've spoken about a lot in the last sort of few months of videos, which is we've got this narrative which is happening now. Everybody knows there's an economic crisis, like everybody can see that, right? Like, it's affecting people directly, and everybody wants the government to help, and the government is saying, oh, well, there's only so much we can do, right? And nobody ever talks about the fact that in the last 2.5 years we've seen the biggest and fastest ever increase in millionaire and billionaire wealth. That the average billionaire increased their wealth by 22% in the first 1 year of COVID. That £450 billion went from the government to the rich, right? Like, the government gave £450 billion to the rich, and now they're saying, well, I'm sorry, there's no money. And I think this sort of perfectly draws that connection that, look, if the rich don't pay taxes, it affects the rest of us, you know. And I think it's important to realise, you know, public services will still have to be provided, and if the rich don't pay taxes, somebody else has to. And, you know, I was in this situation, and you might have been in this situation yourself, where you are working for people, bringing their tax level down, and they're able to do that, pay low level of taxes, because they're getting income from wealth. Whereas you, who are getting your income from working, and probably getting lower income than them, I don't know about you, but I paid 50% income tax when I was working. So were you in a situation where you were paying higher rates of tax than the people you were working for, who were much richer than you?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I suspect in some cases, when you look at the proportion of my income that was taxed, perhaps it was overall that I was paying proportionately higher taxes than some of the people I worked with, for sure. Particularly people that are relying on dividend income, you know, rental income. When you tot up how much tax you're paying as an ordinary person, you know, VAT, you're bearing council tax and income tax, national insurance, and it's a lot.
And when it comes to passing like large amounts of wealth down from generation to generation, would you say very rich families and very rich people are generally able to do that at very low levels of tax?
I think it depends on how things are structured. In some cases, particularly if there's an offshore element, so if there's, you know, some wealth is held in a different country, There's definitely ways where there's almost no tax at all. But for mainly people that are based in the UK, there are ways that they can pass on significant assets without paying any tax at all. There's the kind of 7-year rule where, you can make a gift, however large or small, and if you survive 7 years from the date of making that gift, then people escape inheritance tax, which ordinarily would be paid when you die.
What I find interesting about this is this: if you put yourself in the shoes of a wealthy family, and there are a lot of families who have some level of wealth, it's often not much, and they're thinking about preserving that wealth. You can kind of understand, okay, well, we've got this wealth, we want to preserve it, we want to pass it down. But if you think about the consequence of that, if you imagine a wealthy family that has, say, assets of 20 million, which is not crazy rich, they're much richer families, and they want to manage their wealth such that they pass it all down without being able to pay any tax. If you've got 20 million pounds, you're going to generate income every year of about 600,000 pounds, right? So if these families are able to preserve their wealth, it also means they will never ever sell any assets, right? They will only ever buy assets, they will only ever accumulate assets, which also means that the other young people from other families that don't have assets won't have access to those assets. So the flip side of sort of wealthy people preserving their wealth is you basically guarantee that young people from poor families will never be able to buy property. I think this is sort of this, and it's that connection that I want people to understand, which is, look, if you guarantee that all of the assets belonging to the rich will stay belonging to those people's kids, you also guarantee that young people from poorer families will never get assets. And I think this is a really important part of the housing crisis to understand, which is, look, if you give all of the houses to the rich people, and you put rich people in a situation where they will never ever sell any houses, then of course no one else will ever be able to buy a house. I think this is it's that connection I want people to understand, which is, look, being rich might be great for rich people, but if you allow them to get richer and richer and richer, it's inevitable that ordinary families will get poorer. Do you see the connection I'm trying to make?
Well, yeah, they get poorer, but also in a way kind of disenfranchised from the economy. The economy that they prop up by, spending in the real economy, I think, one rule that I developed was follow the money. There's these ongoing wealth transfers in favour of someone that are happening all the time.
Yeah.
Every time we spend money or pay rent.
But one thing that upsets me is like how difficult it's become for, I had a very good job and I was very well paid. And, I've been to elite universities, so I know other people that have good jobs and well paid. And what I see is my friends, even who have really good jobs, earning much higher than average, they can't afford property. And they don't really understand how and why that's happening. If, I've got a friend who earns like 70 grand, it's much higher than the average. He's living with his mum, he's saving up every penny, can't afford to buy a house. And the flip side, you see these people from very rich families who might not even work, getting houses sort of given to them and paying no tax on it. And I just think what upsets me most is that ordinary people are not really being told the true story about what's happening. They're getting these stories in newspapers about, well, it's because you going to Starbucks too much.
Yeah. You were spending all your money on smashed avocado and poached eggs. Yeah. That's something that I really notice, and that's the difference between wealth and income, right? If you have a family that will give you a £250,000 deposit, so you don't have to take out a massive mortgage, your level of income is relatively insignificant, but you're someone, compared with someone who has a high income but doesn't have assets behind them, that's the difference between wealth and income, right? You can't.
And that's the point that I really want to make, which is that this is not about hating rich people. This is not a witch hunt. This is about, look, these people are affecting the lives of ordinary people.